Wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies to welcome everyone to our symposium, After Vilnius, Which Way for Ukraine. This symposium, I should say right at the beginning, would not have been possible without the generous financial support of the Alberta Society for the Advancement of Ukrainian Studies, and we thank and acknowledge them for that. In particular, its mafia godfather, Bogdan Medvitsky. Yes, that's very appropriate. I don't think Bogdan gets enough applause. I also want to thank my organizing committee, listed on the back. They've done a wonderful job in helping to put this together, both the logistics and the planning of the speakers and so on. As some of you know, last October, the CIUS put on a conference in anticipation of the Vilnius summit of the European Union, at which summit an association agreement with Ukraine was to be signed. But even then, we were already thinking of a follow-up event such as this one. So it's been a while in the planning. But little did we know or expect what would follow President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to postpone the signing of that agreement. As we are all too well aware, dreadful events have followed. There have been demonstrations, barricades, beatings, shootings, disappearances, a revolutionary situation, one could say. There's even talk of civil war. Now, I thought that Ukraine's position on the planet was more or less permanent. That is, wasn't going anywhere. But no, we now, as a result of these, this declining of the Ukraine to sign the agreement, we've now witnessing a tug of war over Ukraine by Russia on the one side and the EU and Canada and the United States on the other, all because a piece of paper wasn't signed. And it's also obvious in this situation that the European Union has no security policy regarding events on its periphery, just as it did not during the Yugoslav wars of succession in the early 1990s. Fortunately, we are pleased to welcome and to welcome back 3 experts to help us understand this awful situation in Ukraine and the hopeful or hopeless prospect before us. They are Amanda Paul, who is policy analyst with the European Policy Schools, Taras Kuzio, who I think lives in Toronto, but maybe lately he's been living on an airplane because he's here and there and everywhere. He's not only at the CIUS, but he's also a non-resident fellow at Johns Hopkins University in the States. And thirdly, Bogdan Nahailo, who lives just outside of Geneva. He's an independent scholar, veteran Ukraine watcher, and he's too modest to include it in his one-liner under his name in the program, but he's a former officer of the UN Human Rights Commission. The discussant is Laurie Thorlikson, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Studies at the university here, and now also director of the European Union Center of Excellence at the university. The CIUS is very appreciative of her two contributions to this conference. One is that her center is sponsoring the visit of Amanda Paul, and secondly, that she herself is acting as discussant in this seminar. However, tonight, this afternoon, we have something of a bonus for you. We are fortunate to have, by Skype, from Ukraine, Professor Oleksiy Harain of the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, National University, who can give us some first-hand interpretation of events. I had asked him to speak on whether, in his opinion as a political scientist, Ukraine can expect civil war, revolution, or stalemate. And because it's late at night already in Kyiv, I'm giving him the opening position on this symposium. So he will have about 20 minutes to give us his thoughts. We can open the floor for a bit of discussion, and then we can proceed with the rest of the program as printed and advertised. So, Oleksiy, are you ready to go?
Дорогі колеги, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for all those in Canada who in this or that way is helping Ukrainians fighting for freedom in Ukraine. We know that you are doing a lot, really a lot, in order to mobilize international support for Ukrainian cause, and we do appreciate it. As Professor Gerasimov said, the question for me is whether it's civil war, revolution, or stalemate. And actually, the second question, which Professor Gerasimov suggested to me, was is association agreement dead or not? But I would say the answer to the second question is simple, because it depends on the first one. So it depends on the domestic development in Ukraine, on whether Ukrainians would be able to change the regime, or at least to create a balanced system of checks and balances. So, first, is it civil war, revolution, or stalemate? I would like to say that it started as massive protests. Now it's at the stage of, I would say, uprising. I would call it uprising now. The question if it will become revolution or not, so we will see. It's in the process. Maybe yes. And I hope that actually it will lead to the change of regime, and not only to the change of regime, but also to successful reforms in Ukraine. Whether it will become civil war, definitely Putin would like to provoke such kind of thing in Ukraine. But I would say objectively there's no background for civil war in Ukraine. I would call it now, what we have now is actually the war of the criminal regime against its own people, because we see uprising in many parts. Do you hear me?
Yes.
We see this uprising in many parts of the country, also in the south, in the center of Ukraine. We have Euromaidans in Donetsk and Lugansk. So, despite all the differences, I believe now we have more politically united Ukrainian nation, more united Ukrainian nation which can emerge from this crisis. I would say that now, analyzing what happened yesterday, we can call it a stalemate. We do not know how the development would go. The day before yesterday, there was quite a positive dynamic. And definitely, if opposition would manage to push its variant on freeing those who was detained, it would give additional momentum, and perhaps even lead to the rise of constitutional changes in the parliament. Unfortunately, it didn't. It didn't happen. And you know that we call the law, it's not law on amnesty, it's law on hostages. We call it Somalian law. Yesterday's development actually clearly shown that we shouldn't believe any word, any promise from President Yanukovych. He doesn't want to make real concessions. He is calling for, actually he is imitating negotiations, but he is ready to attack at any moment. And just tonight I've seen the interview with Andrei Parubi, who is commandant of Maidan, and he said that every day Maidan is expecting potential storm of Maidan. So the situation remains, I would say, remains quite tense. What is the way out of the crisis? Maybe I'm simplifying the things, but it seems to me that the best and the quickest way out of crisis, the way of compromise and of minimal losses, would be return to the constitutional design of 2004. We criticized this constitutional design when it was in force, but it appeared that definitely concentrating of so much power in hands of one person is detrimental to Ukraine, whatever is the name of this person. And definitely when the name is Yanukovych, the consequences are awful. So ideal scenario would be the change of the regime, dismissal of Yanukovych, and early presidential elections, maybe combined with parliamentary elections. But for the time being, there's no enough force. So potentially the way of compromise would be to return to the constitutional design of 2004, where we would have so-called Polish variant. President is Yanukovych for 1 year, for one additional year until the elections, next elections, and the government is controlled by the parliament, and perhaps this government would include, or maybe even headed by opposition leaders. Again, Yanukovych doesn't want to make concessions, but we see the signs of potential split within the Party of Regions, and according to different sources, about 50 deputies from Party of Regions yesterday, they were ready to vote for oppositional draft law on freeing those who were detained. But then Yanukovych twice came to the parliament. He had this special, very dramatic meeting with Party of Regions, and there were cries and shouts from the hall, and it appeared that Yanukovych finally, let's say, persuaded the deputies from Party of Regions to support his proposal. But again, it shows that there is potential to have some kind of agreement with at least part of Party of Regions, maybe the part which is controlled by Akhmetov and other oligarchs. I'm really sorry because actually I'm sick, so let me finish with two points. First, and I believe it's very important, because after the violence erupted in Ukraine, we heard from our Western partners that it's not good, that it's necessary to keep peaceful, and so on and so forth. And definitely everybody is in favor of peaceful solution and peaceful development. And we Ukrainians managed to keep the protests peaceful for 2 months, despite all the provocations and despite the fact that actually we didn't receive any substantial help from the West. There were a lot of very strong statements, good statements, very important from symbolic point of view statements regarding Ukraine and the fate of democracy in Ukraine. But we Ukrainians, after events of November 30, demanded at least sanctions, at least against one person, Minister of Interior. At least visa ban for him to enter the EU and other civilized countries. And we didn't receive it. So that's important to understand, that only now the West has started visa ban sanctions, visa ban. And the EU is not involved yet, even in this type of sanctions. And I believe that actually the threat of freezing accounts would be one of the most powerful tools in order to persuade Yanukovych to work on the way of compromise. One more point which I would like to concentrate, and then I would be happy to answer your questions, is the question of so-called single leader. I would like, single leader of Maidan. I would like to differentiate here between single leader and single candidate for future elections, because I believe that if we have the constitutional reform and there would be, there would be possibility to create a single team of opposition, and it would be easier to find who will be the single candidate for presidency, who will be the candidate supported to become premier and so prime minister and so on. But now it's not the time to talk about that, because actually we are not sure that we will have free and fair elections in 2015. There's a lot of doubts about that under Yanukovych regime. And suddenly, well, it's not suddenly because people demanded, but you know, to proclaim one leader of Maidan in Ukrainian situation appears to be not realistic. There were different revolutions, different transformations and transitions in different countries, and in some countries one leader emerged, one clear leader, and in some countries there was collective leadership. Let's remind the experience of Latvia and Estonia. In Lithuania there was a clear leader, Landsbergis, and Latvia and Estonia not. It was kind of collective leadership. So I believe that we should assess the situation pragmatically. We have 3 opposition leaders, and despite all the forecasts, they cooperate. You know, I believe that even maybe 1 year ago, even I wouldn't say that it would be easy for them to cooperate, but nevertheless they demonstrate cooperation. Definitely there is a fight of ambitions, but they demonstrate this cooperation, and this is really important. Just so demands to declare single leader in Maidan, I believe, frankly speaking, they would lead not to a constructive development. And actually what happened on January 19th demonstrated that. Because some people after the end of each year, they came to the scene of Maidan and demanded that we should have single leader, we should go to the Rada, to block Rada, and then the violence erupted. Just one more sentence is about Technibok and Svoboda, because usually we consider this party as a very radical, and Technibok as a person who is making, who could make provocative statements. I must say that this time when he made it, the statements, is far away. It's very strange, but he demonstrates himself as a very balanced leader, and this during also internal discussions, and when he is persuading Maidan to follow this or that scenario, he sounds very balanced and pragmatic and persuasive to people in Maidan. Again, I'm not saying that he is the person who could become single leader, definitely not, because he still represents the party which is supported by lesser part of Ukrainians. But I am just, giving it as examples that people are changing. Maidan is pushing them. And we see the evolution of Chernybok to more moderate and balanced position. And the same is actually about Svoboda in general. Such radical. Okay, perhaps I will stop here.
Yes. Thank you very much.
We have time for a couple of questions from Alexei, for Alexei, from you. Anybody want to? Yes, please.
I don't hear you.
Perszy mikrofon.
Yes, now, yes.
Thank you for this informative talk. Very much appreciated. My question to you is, I'm a single Ukrainian, and I'd like to support Ukraine, but I'm finding it difficult what I'm able to do here in Canada to support Ukraine. So my question to you is, what can we do to help
Okay. That's actually the question. I'm bombarded by this question from my colleagues who are now in Canada, in Toronto. Well, first of all, what you did already is that you pressed your government and finally government appeal. I'm not sure if there is any business of Ukrainian oligarchs in connected to Canada. If there is such business, then you can demand freezing accounts and sanctions accounts against the business of those oligarchs who is supporting Yanukovych, who are supporting Yanukovych. Then ordinary people are collecting money, collecting clothes. You know, now it's 20 degrees below zero in Ukraine, even more, and people are standing in Maidan. So, material help would be appreciated as well. But what you can do is also sign different petitions of intellectuals, asking, writing pieces to press, Canadian and international, different blogs, internet, Twitters, and so to mobilize public opinion. And it was very pleasant for me to see the statement from world intellectuals, which was published in Guardian about months ago in support of Ukraine, with the idea of new Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And just recently there was another letter, and I believe in both letters I saw the name of Professor Zenon Kogut. So we understand that these letters couldn't appear without support from you, initiatives from you, and mobilization which you are doing among academia. So basically that's how I see it. And then, you see, you need to be inventive. You know, many people are asking here, what can I do for Maidan? And my answer is, do whatever you want. Whatever you can, whatever you can. Some people are staying in Maidan, some can just wear yellow and blue ribbons, some may give money, some are giving food, and to those people who cannot go to Maidan, cannot prepare food, we say, just pray for Ukraine, pray for Ukrainians.
Taras Kuzio has a question.
Alexei, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I'd like to ask is, because I don't see it published anywhere, is...
Would you please speak slower,
right.
slower, because it's not very good connection, yes.
Okay. What I have not seen published, and what I fear, which is what the problem was in 2004, 2005, is do these opposition leaders have any program to deal with Ukraine when, and I don't say if, I say when they come to power. Because the problems that they will encounter will be massive. And is there the intellectual capability? Because it's very easy to be against something, as we were in 2004 as well, but we saw it was more difficult to know what to do when you're in power. So I don't see Tyagnybok, Yatsenyuk, and Klitschko preparing these alternative proposals as to what they will do when they're in power. Am I wrong?
Well, I would say that, yeah, this is the usual question we hear, that opposition need to have constructive program. And Taras, you are a very good specialist on the Ukraine, and you know that after Yushchenko was elected, there were a lot of programs and a lot of good advice. And we remember them, reports of Blue Ribbon Commission, analytical suggestion by the Razumkov Center. There were different programs, a lot of them, which actually there were suggestions from Kalyushka Center, Center for Legal Reforms. I'm not talking about economy because I'm not specialist in economy. But basically it's clear what is necessary to do. The problem is about political will. So if we analyze the present day situation, I believe there is a general understanding that opposition needs to come with a program. And I can say you that within Association Maidan, or Maidan, I do not know how to translate it correctly, all Ukrainian Association of Maidan, there are different commissions, and there is a programmatic commission, and this commission include Valery Chaly, Alexander Sushko, Victoria Sumar, Igor Kalyushka, and other very important names of Ukrainian experts. And what they are doing now, they started to develop the strategy for Ukraine, strategy for reform, and to the best of my knowledge, it's actually two-thirds or half, at least half is prepared. My understanding is that definitely the recent development drew attention from that programmatic work. But this programmatic work is being doing.
I'll just allow one more question because time is running on, and perhaps the other questions can be held till later. Yaris Balan.
Definitely, the question depends on when she will be freed, because it's clear that if Yanukovych is ousted, if he overthrown, Tymoshenko would be free. But if Yanukovych remains, it's difficult to imagine that he's going to make this concession. Maybe you know, the situation is very, very dynamic, and it can go either that or that way. I would say that if Tymoshenko is that if we are coming to the constitutional design of 2004, and it seems that many people agree, and experts, and all the opposition parties, including Svoboda, agree about that, it would mean that the role of one person would be diminished. So, well, I'm speculating now. But you can imagine that Klitschko cannot be prime minister and he cannot be speaker. So what would be the logical position for him? He may become symbolic president. Well, him throughout the world would be important for the country. The prime minister could be Tymoshenko or Yatsenyuk or Poroshenko. Speaker could be, say, Poroshenko or Yatsenyuk or Chernybok. Chernybok may become speaker or secretary, for example, of National Council for Security and Defense. I'm speculating, you know. But I mean that if we are talking about return to the constitutional design of 2004, it would be easier to solve this equation.
Okay, I'm going to cut it off there, and Alexei, you're free to follow the rest of the proceedings if you wish, or you should go back to bed and try to get well. And anyway, on behalf of the whole people assembled here, I want to thank you very, very much. I want to thank you very, very much for...
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you?
Oh, the marvels of modern technology. All right. I know there are other questions, but before we get into any more questions, let's go back to the formal part of our program, and I'm going to ask Amanda Paul to present her paper, or at least the gist of it, in about 20 minutes. After that, it'll probably be 2:30 and time for us to have refreshments. In the meantime, while you're listening to Amanda's talk, please fill in the registration form. It's required by the SBU. No, it isn't really. And in pursuance of the laws of December 17th. No, not that either. We would just like to keep in touch with all of our friends, fans, and supporters. So without any further ado, here's Amanda Paul.
Shall I come now or stay here?
It's up to you. You've got the mic.
Your mic is
Okay, is it working? Okay, good. Glad everybody can hear me. So, hello again. Happy to see some familiar faces from yesterday night and some new faces today. I was actually woken up this morning at 4 o'clock by a phone call because I forgot to put my telephone on silent. It was a Polish journalist, and he was calling to ask me about Ukraine. And he told me that the Polish Prime Minister had started to do a tour of EU capitals to try and convince his counterparts around Europe to have a more engagement or a stronger position vis-à-vis Ukraine. And you think it's quite astounding that we are actually at a point where the Prime Minister has to do that. You'd think they would have seen already the situation in Ukraine. And it's very embarrassing, I mean, for my own Prime Minister, David Cameron. I had a look at the statements he's been making vis-à-vis Ukraine over the last few days, and they're still, you know, very mild. I don't think Mr. Cameron has sort of understood the seriousness of the situation in the country. I mean, the EU is facing the biggest crisis on its borders since the Balkans War. It's not Syria, of course, but it's still a very serious situation. But I think this reflects the lack of strategic thinking from the EU. It also underlines the fact that the EU's priorities are calculated by the major capitals in the EU. Unfortunately, Poland is not one of the major capitals in the EU these days. So on the side of the EU, you have this lack of strategic thinking. On the other side, in Ukraine, you've had for as long as I've been following relations with Ukraine, also a lack of capacity to lead. And of course, President Yanukovych represents the worst out of all of these leaders that have been running Ukraine for several years. But I would say, in my opinion, that until now, Ukraine has never had any sort of legitimate or decent leader able to push forward democratization, reforms, and modernize the country. So all of the opposition leaders that we have in Ukraine today, with the exception of Mr. Klitschko, actually, because Mr. Klitschko, I would say, has a certain amount of greater legitimacy because he's sort of a blank page. He doesn't have any baggage from the past, make him, I would say, a more interesting possibility to eventually, hopefully, lead Ukraine one day in the future, if of course, he would be allowed to, because of the relevant legislation. But I don't want to give you an account again of EU-Ukraine relations for the last 15 years, because I did that yesterday night, so I think it would be very boring. But I think it's fair to say that it's been a journey with many ups and downs. On the one hand, of course, Ukraine has never made the real efforts to reform and modernize to meet the criteria that's laid down by the EU to progress in European integration. But on the other hand, the European Union has continued to have a policy where it hasn't really engaged with Ukraine as it has done with other regions and countries in that area. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Western Balkans, I mean, the EU has had a proper strategy for the Western Balkans. And what's the difference between the Western Balkans and Ukraine, you might say? I mean, I'm still wondering what that question is. I mean, the EU will say they needed to have a different strategy to offer the Western Balkan countries a membership perspective to avoid having an ongoing conflict or blood being spilt in the region. But I have to ask myself, if the Western Balkans hadn't been given a clear perspective, somewhere to head to, what would it look like today? I would imagine it would look quite similar to Ukraine, possibly even worse. So I think this issue where the EU continue to have this policy of saying to Ukraine's elites, you have to do your homework, you have to reform the country, you have to meet all these benchmarks before we can perhaps one day consider giving Ukraine a European future. I think this is a mistake. Unfortunately, this opinion is not shared by most EU leaders, but I do think it's a mistake. And as we all know, the latest twist in the EU-Ukraine relationship happened in November, when after 4 years of negotiations, the Ukrainian authorities announced that they would not be signing their association agreement and deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU at the Vilnius summit. It's quite interesting because up until that point, the EU had thought this decision would be their decision. It would be a decision of the EU to decide whether or not Ukraine would be going forward, whether or not the document would be signed. So I think it took some people in the EU by surprise, and perhaps it would have been more intelligent of Ukraine's leadership to actually go to Vilnius and have the EU declare that it didn't want to sign the agreement because of Ukraine not having met the relevant criteria that the EU had laid down, principally the freeing of Mrs. Yulia Tymoshenko and a couple of other reforms that Ukraine hadn't done. I wouldn't like to say whether or not the EU would have actually signed that agreement in Vilnius, because there was a lot of divisions among EU member states. But clearly, if that had been the case, the situation in Ukraine, I think, perhaps it would have been slightly different to how it is today. But as we've seen now in the streets of Kiev and elsewhere, protesters have stood underneath the EU flag, and the EU has an important role to play, more so than ever now, in Ukraine's future, because they look to Europe as an example basically of everything that they haven't got, but they want: democracy, freedoms, rights, and prosperity. And of course, for many in Ukraine, the European integration is not just a piece of paper, it's not just association agreement, it's not any of those things. It's just a civilization project. It's something that holds the country together, something no other integration project could have, including, of course, the famous Russian-led customs union. And just a few words about Russia. I mean, one of the reasons why President Yanukovych had said that he wasn't going to go ahead with the agreements was because of the pressure that Russia had placed on Ukraine for several months that was leading up to the Vilnius summit. We all know about all the sanctions and all these sort of things on trade. I think this combined with the fact he used the argument that it was going to cost Ukraine so much money that they would basically collapse, a bankruptcy, so to speak, if they'd signed the agreement. I think it's fair to say that it would have cost Ukraine a lot of money. I mean, to implement the trade agreement would have cost ultimately, I think it was 10 billion euros. Yanukovych had told the EU in Vilnius it would cost 168 billion, which was an exaggeration.
His percentage on top.
Well, yeah, his percentage, exactly. But one does have to put the question, frankly speaking, I mean, why did the EU insist on negotiating such a heavy document? I mean, the trade agreement is a very, very heavy document. It takes about 70 or 80% of the EU acquis, meaning all the different laws and regulations that the EU has. Ukraine was going to have to meet these. Some of them, of course, had transition periods, etc. But ultimately, it was an awful lot of laws and legislations to take on board with a big price for a document that didn't even have a membership perspective. So this is a big question mark. And of course, you could also say that if the EU perhaps hadn't pushed the Yulia Tymoshenko issue so much, this could have also had maybe perhaps a more positive end result in terms of having this agreement signed or not. Who knows? We like to think that President Yanukovych played a geopolitical game between Russia and the EU. But just a couple of words about Russia, because I think it deserves it. I know probably most of you in the room aren't a big fan of Russia. For Russia, I mean, Ukraine is both a national and personal issue for President Putin. I mean, when the Eastern Partnership was launched, the Russians, I wouldn't say they were that bothered about it. In those days, which was like 5 years ago, they were much more concerned about NATO enlargement of Ukraine and Georgia. But obviously in 2008, they put an end to it. That was the end of the story. But I think as we got closer and closer to the Vilnius summit, or these countries, not just Ukraine, but others, got further down the road, the Russians started to get more concerned and started to undermine the project. And we know the biggest way they did this was by creating their own integration project, the Customs Union stroke Euro-Asian Union. I mean, clearly President Putin created the Euro-Asian Union directly to compete with the association agreement in DCFTA, although I would say there's not very much to compete with, because Customs Union, Euro-Asian Union is basically a political project. But the difference between the Russia and the EU is that Russia sees this region very strategically. Even though it doesn't have a strategy, it's got an objective, and it's got a very big toolbox to use to achieve this. The EU doesn't see it like that. It sees it as a, let's say, as a technical process. So Russia started down the road of using every single tool it could to derail the process. We've seen Armenia was the first country to go, and Ukraine was the second. I mean, Russia continues to see this region as its privileged sphere of influence. It has a zero-sum approach to this region. And of course, you could also say that Russia has in its benefit the fact that most of these countries are not democratically led. So of course, if you don't have a proper democracy, it's much easier to manipulate the leadership. I think if Ukraine had a democratic leader, they wouldn't have been able to undermine the process so quickly, because ultimately they would have been more accountable to the people. Unfortunately, Russia seems to view the EU agreements as undermining itself, undermining its interests. It claimed that the trade agreements would wreck the Russian economy. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. It would have been perfectly possible for all of these countries, Ukraine included, to negotiate a free trade agreement with the customs union. But of course, Russia has never been interested in this, because it's not about economics, it's about politics. I mean, it's a political thing for the Russians. And for Ukraine particularly, Russia does not want to lose Ukraine, because it sees being with Ukraine, or in a way connected to Ukraine, as giving itself strength. A Russia without Ukraine, in the eyes of the Kremlin, is much weaker. So ultimately, I think the Russians saw what happened in Ukraine as a success story for them. I wouldn't say it was a success story, given what's happened thereafter. I think that President Putin probably shot himself in the foot, because consequently, this whole region, not just Ukraine, Armenia, Moldova, all of the countries that are in the Eastern Partnership, the Russian approach has made the populations and society despise the Russian leadership much more than they ever did before. So just a few words about what happens next. We had the fiasco at Vilnius. Obviously, it was very embarrassing for the EU, because after 4 or 5 years of Eastern Partnership, they have nothing to show for it. Ukraine was supposed to be the jewel in the crown. Ukraine has collapsed, basically, as part of the Eastern Partnership. The rest of it, we have Moldova and Georgia left, but who knows what's going to happen there. As I said, no party is totally blameless for what happened at Vilnius. I don't think Yanukovych was ever really committed to the EU. He played a game of political poker. Unfortunately, it left him hostage to the Kremlin, and his political future now looks very, very questionable. The EU drafted agreements that were inadequately balanced between incentives and obligations, which in itself made them very vulnerable to Russian efforts at sabotage. So just finally, the situation that we have now, I mean, I would agree with what we just heard. I mean, President Yanukovych is playing for time. I mean, he's messing everybody around. He's trying to manipulate EU leaders, and he's also trying to manipulate public opinion. I mean, the concessions that he has made, I mean, I wouldn't even call them concessions, frankly speaking. I mean, the Prime Minister, who was a terrible man, should have resigned, weeks and weeks ago. I mean, it took 2 months to get him to resign, when he should have done it a long time ago, and his government as well. But ultimately, this government will just be reshuffled, and we'll just have a new set of players from the same despicable regime, quite frankly. I think the EU needs to have a much higher level of political engagement with Ukraine, the need to support much more obviously the people out in the streets and civil society, etc. I mean, a Ukrainian friend of mine who was previously working in the government, he has spent the last 2 weeks actually traveling around, meeting people from different foreign ministries. And it's actually quite, I mean, soul-destroying to hear the stories that he would tell of the response that he would get. I mean, in Berlin, for example, I mean, I know that Angela Merkel has made a couple of statements recently saying you should listen to your people in the streets. I don't know what she actually means by that, as opposed to the EU listening to them. But in the foreign ministry in Germany, he was told Germany will not be supporting sanctions on Ukraine, on certain people, because they don't see the situation as serious enough to threaten their own interests in the region. I mean, this is extremely short-sighted, frankly speaking. I mean, I agree that the EU needs to take much stronger measures, the targeted sanctions and definitely the targeting of the assets of oligarchs, etc., particularly in countries where you do have a lot of oligarch money, including my own country, a London grad, etc. There's a lot of money there. And when it comes to Russia as well, I mean, frankly speaking, I think the EU's approach to what the Russians have done is actually ridiculous. I mean, they've made a lot of statements again. The EU is very good at making statements. They haven't gone beyond that, other than, of course, cancelling the dinner with President Putin. But if you look at it realistically, I mean, the EU is Russia's largest economic partner. Half of Russia's international trade is with the EU, and 3/4 of the foreign investment that Russia gets comes from EU member states. So there's actually plenty of things that they could do in terms of having an impact on Russian business in these countries, instead of just sitting around saying, oh, we can't do anything about the Russians because we're dependent on them for energy, or we don't want to upset the Russians because we need them in Afghanistan or Syria. But again, I think this is a reflection of the 3 or 4 big member states who don't want to rock the boat with Russia for their own different reasons. And just a last word, because I know I've run out of time. We don't know what's going to happen next. I really hope that President Yanukovych doesn't last another day. I hope that it's probably very undiplomatic to say this, the illness that he's apparently suffering from today because of stress would be fatal, and we would see him disappear from Ukraine's political scene. But I think we do have to consider that he may be there for another year, unfortunately. But even if he is, definitely we're going to have a change of leadership in 1 year. I guess he will try to cheat. I guess the Russians will try to help him cheat, and I guess the Russians will probably try all sort of tricks in between once the Olympics are over. But I think the EU, while the Ukrainian side do need to get their act together and come up with some concrete policies, at the same time, the EU needs to come up with a concrete policy, because they cannot continue with this lack of strategy and this very lightweight policy that they've had towards Ukraine, because doing this would be an absolute insult to the people who have been out in the streets fighting for a better future, a future that they see is linked to Europe. So I hope it's not just going to be a question of saying, look, here's the association agreement in DCFTA that you agreed. We can tweak it, we can change it, but we're not going to give you a membership perspective. I really hope that after what we've seen now, the EU is ready to go a step further and really offer the Ukrainian people, which are people in a country that is clearly European, the right to have a European future as their neighbours Poland and Hungary have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time. So let's take a 10-minute break, but let's be punctual, shall we? And resume our seats in 10 minutes. Have some refreshments, and then we continue with the program. Thank you very much.
Amanda's talked more about the European Union angle and the sort of foreign policy angle. I'll talk more about domestic and then Bogdan will sort of take it to where are we going from here, and what does this mean in terms of Ukraine history and politics, which I think is right. So bear with me. Well, first of all, this is not just about the EU, of course, although people understand that the first straw that broke the camel's back was a decision on the EU. But remember that discontent has been simmering for 4 years since 2010. It hasn't exploded because people were still very disillusioned with the Yushchenko era and the failure of the Orange Revolution. But what we've had is an attack on all fronts, really, on Ukrainian identity, Tabachnik and co., Ministry of Education, on democracy, which culminated in Black Thursday, when Ukraine became a dictatorship, and of course the straw that broke the camel's back was the decision on the EU. Now, these three areas, ethnic identity, democracy, Europe, are basically the pillars upon which the independent Ukraine was built. And those were like the national idea for Ukraine. So if you're attacking Ukraine on those areas, as well as asset stripping and stealing the country blind as well, and you have zero dignity for the people you rule over, the people in Kiev kind of look upon the Donetsky as a foreign occupation army in some ways, then inevitably you're going to have an explosion sooner or later. And the decision in end of November was that led to that explosion. But it's more than just the EU question at work here. And that's why I think I describe it as like different revolutions going on at the same time. And I think a good way of understanding this is that, I mean, it's simplified, of course, because I don't have much time, but if you can talk about East Ukrainians traditionally ran Ukraine, not West Ukrainians. 3 of Ukraine's presidents have been East Ukrainian, including Yushchenko. Now, that's because industry and urban centers are in eastern Ukraine. But in the Soviet Union, it was Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv that ran Ukraine. Donetsk was a backwater and had no influence really in Kiev. The differences between these elites are key. The elites that came to power in the post-Soviet space were a mixture of senior nomenclatura from the Communist Party and the Komsomol, Communist Youth League, and in some cases nationalists and national democrats. Moldova, Georgia, for example, the nationalists in the Baltic states. But this is the only country, as far as I know, in the Eurasian space, former Soviet space, former USSR, where criminalized elites have come to power. This is a very different elite. So in the Kuchma era, what you had in many ways was a continuation of the Soviet period, where the senior levels of the Communist Party, the Komsomol, and the former dissidents who became National Democrats worked together. They were anti-communist, anti-Crimean Russian nationalist, pro-European, and Kuchma supported a soft Ukrainian identity. In fact, Ukrainian language spread greater under Kuchma than under Yushchenko. Now, the origins of the Yanukovych groups are very, very different. They primarily came from working class, not from the elites of the Communist Party, and heavily involved with criminal groups. In November in Kiev, I interviewed Yuri Lutsenko, former police chief, and he told me that in the 90s, when there was very rampant violence in certain regions of Ukraine, the first most violent, i.e. number of murders, was Crimea, second Donetsk. To explain this, you have to understand that neighboring oblasts to Donetsk, like Kharkiv or Dnipropetrovsk, did not have that violence. This was very much a Donetsk thing. And this violence and high levels of murders didn't end until 1999, when Yanukovych was governor, and a year later, when the top criminal group won out over the other, they formed the party regions. The party regions then united these ex-Red directors of big Soviet enterprises, newly emerging oligarchs, and criminal groups. And according to Hennady Moskal, who's the deputy head of the Parliamentary Committee on Organized Crime, there are still 18 members of the party regions with ties to crime. So you have very different origins of these elites, and that is reflected in their approaches to domestic and foreign policies. So the Donetsk clan, therefore, is very different to the Kravchuks, the Kuchmas, the Yushchenko, even the Yushchenko and the Shevardnadzes in Georgia, the Aliyevs in Azerbaijan and elsewhere. More thuggish, more authoritarian. If this had been a crisis under Kuchma, say, there would have been a round table and the resolution of this and the firing of a prime minister in early December, the latest. And just the level of greed is even greater than anything we saw in the 90s. Alexander Yanukovych's son, who, he was a dentist and now is in the top 50 wealthiest in Ukraine. Changing teeth must be expensive in Ukraine. He demands 50% of your business, not 10%, 50%. So in that sense, Kuchma, I think, is in the tradition of Petro Shelest, whereas Yanukovych is in the tradition of Shcherbitsky. Tymoshenko, why was she so... I never believed he was going to release her. I was in the minority, by the way. I said this in November at the conference here, and a lot of people didn't like I said that. Why? Because in a similar way to Khodorkovsky in Russia, the same principle applied. You put one of the top elites in jail, and that sends a signal to the others, watch it, stay in line, or else you're next. And that's the only purpose of this. So it was very difficult. You can find this paper by Kodelia online. He wrote this. I think it's a very, very important way of trying to understand why keeping her in prison was so important because the elites in 2004 were divided. Some put their eggs in different baskets. Some supported Yushchenko, whereas Yanukovych was always trying to sledgehammer them into supporting him. Also, which is something I think Western policymakers found impossible to understand until now. What were his goals? Well, he's a mafia don. That's what he is. I have a very good